Welcome to Signals and Stories, 10 Years with the Vertex Project, a limited series exploring how cyber threat intelligence has evolved over the past decade. In each episode, we break down how analysts actually investigate, covering the data and the decisions that shape real-world intelligence. Stay tuned. Hello, and welcome to our limited series. We're doing 10 episodes to represent 10 years since the Vertex Project opened its doors. I'm Callie Fencl, and today I'm sitting down with our analysts at the Vertex Project, Ryann Hallback, aka Ryann, Jennifer Kolde, aka thesilence, and Mary Beth Lee, aka Savage. This is our second episode with our analysts, and today we're going to be talking about how analysts actually think during an investigation. So I'm excited to talk to you all today. Welcome back.
Hey, Callie.
Thank you for
Appreciate you guys doing this.
Of course.
So I guess we'll just jump into it. You guys introduced yourself on the last episode. So if people are listening to this out of order, please refer back to the last episode. But I guess, from your experience, conducting investigations, where do you typically start? What would you say is the starting point of, when you have an indicator, like what's the first thing that you like to look at?
Nobody wants to go first.
Yeah.
I think the first thing that I would look at is just if we've seen it before. I would look at, whatever system we have internally. So, it's been previous things at previous companies. Internally, obviously, we have Synapse. So if we've seen it before, that's the first thing I want to know instead of me digging into something and enriching it unnecessarily. And then I would typically, go from there and see wherever my nose would follow.
I would say context is a big one because so often through the course of threat intel, you get tossed an indicator and somebody says, what can you tell me about this? And if we have some past context, like Ryann was talking about, that's fine. But otherwise, you have to research that. And if you have no basis for the research, like how was this found? Where was it seen? It really makes your investigation much harder because you don't have a clear direction where to go.
I think the other thing that I would know is the question, does the investigation always start with an indicator or does it start with like a general question? I feel like what Ryann and thesilence both alluded to, starting with an indicator is if someone finds something that's a little weird, but and asks like, what do you know about this? But sometimes it can also be like start out with a question. One of the first teams that I was on was a strategic team, and it would sometimes with the investigations that we would do would start out with noticing kind of patterns of behavior, like why are all these law firms getting targeted by these types of actors or things like that, and it kind of goes from there. So you're not necessarily starting off with a tactical indicator. You're starting off more with something else you notice that's a pattern and asking a question from it and going from there.
Okay, awesome. I guess because I've seen your JIRA tickets, when we talk about like I'm going to investigate to see if this is worth digging into more, like how do you answer that question when you start an investigation? I guess, understanding like if you've seen it before, those context clues, like is there anything else so you make sure that what you're looking at is worth your time, or how do you decide after a while, like actually no, I don't want to look at this any further? How do you make that connection?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is pretty similar to what Ryann and thesilence have mentioned. Like, have we seen this before, or have we already enriched this? Like, is there additional information? And I feel like some of my JIRA tickets are a little wild based off of what I see someone reported about that I think is interesting. Like, what are all these submarines doing over here? Or like, why are these ship patterns in the South China Sea kind of moving in a grid-like behavior? And one of the first things that I'll do is like, do we actually have enough available information to dig into this? Because if we don't have that data, then it's pretty much dead on arrival. And like, we can't, it's an interesting question, but we're not able to answer it, at least right now. So that's really the first thing I'll do is there information that I can pull and then I'll be able to use to even make this worth looking into?
I think with respect to our crazy JIRA tickets, we're in a little bit of a different position. We've all been threat intel analysts for a good portion of our career, but our role within the Vertex Project is a little bit different now because as a company, we don't produce intelligence, but we tell people how to use Synapse. We show people how it can help with their intelligence process and their intelligence workflows. So often we're looking for a novel use case. How can we use the tool to facilitate an investigation or help people discover something that might not have otherwise been apparent? So I think sometimes when we come up with those ideas, it's a little bit of a different context, but I think there's a parallel in industry as well. Commonly, you're researching things that are showing up in your alerts or your stakeholder alerts, or you're asking those or trying to answer those questions that MB was referring to. It's like, what do we know about this, or why are we seeing this pattern? And I think in both of those, there's a commonality of how far can I push this? Does it look like I'm going to come up with some interesting findings, or is there a point kind of diminishing returns where I'm investigating this question or trying to pull this thread, and is it actually going somewhere, or do I need to devote my time and resources to something else?
I guess like so you all have been working really hard on different workshops over the years, like to your point, Jen, on we don't produce, intelligence here. Like we're teaching people how to use Synapse to help their investigations. Like, how do you go about picking those different use cases that are novel? Like what's that process look like when you're creating a workshop to educate people to become the best analyst that they could be?
I think it's very similar.
Yeah.
It's kind of that JIRA ticket process, right? Like we'll come up with an idea for a workshop. It's interesting because workshops and challenges they have some parameters around them, right? They're time bounded. So typically, if we're presenting one of these at a conference, we only have so much time to allow people to go through it. We don't want them to, start and only complete 10% of the challenge. So what can we accomplish in that amount of time? Which typically means we're not necessarily doing a deep dive, but we're kind of showing some of the basics. So frequently we start with these grand ambitions and then have to really scope it back so that we can work within those parameters. But for some of those workshops, that's actually when we get to go back to being analysts again, because we have to pick either a real world data set or a scenario that mirrors something we see in the real world. And then typically we have to go get up to speed on that, do some research, what's the current reporting, what would a good scenario look like, and then how can we build it out? So it's actually fairly involved, and we do try to vary them a little bit, right? Nobody wants to do the same thing over and over again. So sometimes it's a little bit what's topical, what are people talking about, or what are some current trends that we're seeing in the industry. Sometimes it's what's available to us where we can build out something that's fun and interesting and educational within the time that we have.
Do you guys ever do anything where maybe it hasn't been in the news necessarily, so it's not necessarily like a topical thing, but like, have you thought about scenarios where it's like, what if this happened and it hasn't happened yet, but maybe it could? Like, have you done workshop or thought of scenarios like that?
I don't think we really have, because I I think most of it is like we don't want to just make things up without any kind of connection to reality or connection to like a use case that someone would already have. Like that's like one of the ways that we want to be able to kind of help people use the platform is imagining or seeing like how this is how this platform and working in it would be able to fit these use cases that I have. So if we pick a scenario that's like way too off the wall or hasn't really existed yet or doesn't mirror anything in reality, it's hard to have that come back to match a use case, except from a very, very high level of be like, this is the use case is investigating this. And I think there's also kind of like the practical effect as well. If we come up with something that's like a little too wild, we would have to be a lot more creative in figuring out what data would support it, what that would look like, and then asking the poor devs who will oftentimes generate a fake data for us of like, this is what we need and this is what it needs to look like. And if we don't have good examples, or if we're just kind of like flying by the seat of our pants and just completely making up things, it's a lot harder to give them something granular to work with. So I think those are probably our main constraints why we haven't really touched that yet, but maybe we could do it going forward.
No, but I think that makes sense though. Like if it's too off the wall, like I guess how would that help an analyst? Like other than maybe exercising different
It
thinking,
can be,
like ways of thinking.
it can be a little too creative, and it's also, I feel like it, we're making it up anyway. So if we don't give ourselves those parameters of like, this is what prior research or reporting on this looks like, or this is what our prior experience with this type of scenario, like how that can help inform like what we would need or what we would do if we don't have that background. And if it's just something that we're completely making up, it's also just a lot harder for us. And then we have no idea if at the end, like, yeah, this is how you would investigate like a mermaid war or something like that. Like, depending on what we came up with, like we would just be, it would be a lot more work. And I'm not sure what the payoff would necessarily be.
I get to
We
learn
do
more about
sprinkle Easter egg. Sorry.
I was just saying I get to learn more about a mermaid war, and that's pretty awesome.
There would probably be some, marine biologists who would be like, that's not at all how it would happen. You people are quacks. So there's always that risk as well.
We do sprinkle Easter eggs in there. We're sometimes kind of sad because we try to get creative with some of the data that we use for the scenarios, and we kind of hope that people actually find those.
Mm-hmm. Like just coming back to in like the investigative portion of it, and not to be salesy or anything like that, but like how does Synapse help people with different signals? Like how do you know that you're on to something versus it's just noise, like within, like in your time within the platform? Because the three of you have been here for, like, you have both, like you all have quite the tenure here, so I'm just curious like how that's evolved over the 10 years that Synapse has been around.
I think that's a good question. I think going back to the scenarios, I think one of the cool things about the scenarios and how different analysts are able to see themselves in the system is because we typically try to bring a lot of different telemetry together, right? So whether we bring in data from like HR or from Virus Total or whatever vendor, and sometimes people are able to see the data differently because it's modeled, it's structural, and they're always surprised by how easy they're able to see certain connections, right? So if you have a string that may have been observed in an email, and it's also a string that was observed in a forum post and also in something else, it's like, wow, right? These are all things that are connected. Whether or not they're actually valuable or related is a different story. So I think Synapse is great because it allows you to bring, different types of data together.
Mm-hmm.
That's the power. I still personally think that the power lies within the analyst, and it's the responsibility of the analyst to determine what's valuable. So Synapse isn't going to tell you if these connections are relevant, right? And if it's signal versus noise, but it will bring those things to the forefront for you and allow you to see what you at least need to prioritize for evaluation over anything else.
And I would add to that, like the data model, the ability to capture different type of information and build that all into your investigation is really valuable. Like Ryann, I think it was one of the investigations that you had done years ago, like very early on, where it included, I think, commands associated with a specific tool that were found in, I think, like a search someone had done, and was able to tie it to a social media profile, I think a flight that person was on. And I think, was it like a post that they had done showing that they were on that flight or they had like landed in that location. Um, Being able to just tie all those different data sources and pieces of evidence together to support your case rather than just being kind of stuck with like, well, these are my hashes, these are my FQDNs, or just like kind of more of what we think of as like the typical like IOCs that you would be working with in the threat intel space.
And how would you, like, before you all came to Vertex and were using Synapse, like how would you rate how confident you were in relating pieces of infrastructure versus once you came here and started using the tool and teaching others how to do it? Like how can you talk a little bit about like the before and after of the confidence level of that?
Yes. It's a little bit of a trick question because all of us came from Mandiant.
Oh,
So we had prior experience with Synapse's predecessor. But before either of those tools, for me at least, it was what a lot of people I think still use, which is spreadsheets and prose reports and different data sources that you're trying to look at separately and bring together. And in hindsight, right, coming from using all of those different data sources that don't necessarily show you the connections to a system where you can work directly with the data and it's designed to show you those connections, it's really easy to mistake your logic. If you're trying in your head to fuse information from multiple sources, it's easy to misinterpret. It's easy to rely on a report from 2 years ago that hasn't been updated and is no longer completely correct because there's new information and new assessments that have been made. So being able to work directly in the data and see those relationships that are structural within the knowledge graph, it's a really good sanity check for our own tendency to human error. So it's made me a lot more confident because some assumption that I may have made based on trying to fuse all of this data on my own is pretty much there for me in black and white, or in Synapse's case, green and black, where you can't really question it. Like the data's the data. So it's really helped confidence from that perspective for me.
Yeah, it's funny because I'm laughing because I think we all kind of view confidence. We kind of laugh and we're confidence. We're like, what's funny to me is, yes, pre-Mandiant, if you were to ask me about an assessment and it's like, how confident was I? I'm like, oh, I'm confident. But it's a joke because no one asks you to show your work, right? You're typically the once me who knows this intrusion set. You're the expert. And I think a lot of times people don't get challenged. And sometimes you could get challenged, but then you may introduce dirty knowledge. And so, like Jen said, that evidence is key. And I think that's where Synapse definitely comes in, right? Not that we inherently have like a confidence score, like built in. We can add it in if you want, but it's more how confident are you? It's like, show me the money, right? Show me how this is connected and why. So even if I can say I'm confident, I can then say, and let me show you why. And I think that's very cool.
when you talk about showing your work, do you feel or have you noticed that analysts and practitioners aren't really asked to show their work a lot, or is that changing as time has gone by? Or
I don't
I think
know if it's necessarily changing. I feel like, the silence had mentioned that so much of how we're sharing information is still through prose and reporting. Um, in my experience, like showing your work was kind of went to the extent of just in the report. Like once it left your team, and it was very hard to kind of do your due diligence if you were reviewing someone's work or something like that, because you basically had to recreate their investigation if you didn't have. Um, I was on a team that didn't have access to Synapse or Nucleus, which was the predecessor, and that's time consuming and it's difficult to do, and it's just not really scalable. Versus now, if I'm working on something, we're all seeing it because we're all working within the same Synapse instance, and so I can have Jen and Ryan, look at my work and make sure that it makes sense to them as well as just to me. Um, there are things that we've tried to kind of encourage with making it a little bit easier for people to share their work. Like one of the things that we've done is like with Synapse, like you can export nodes and a nodes file and you can share data that way, and then someone can pull that into their Synapse instance. There's also like the Vertex Intel sharing Synapse instance. People can work together, but I'm not entirely sure what it looks like on other teams. I don't know, Ryan or John, you have a better answer for that.
I think it's a problem. And I think there's kind of a weird duality to it. I think that teams internally are doing due diligence for whatever that looks like for them and have processes and workflows and methods that they're using to come to these conclusions, but we don't talk about them. Even at conferences, right? Typically people will come and they'll present their results, and it's less common to hear people talk about how they got there. And we're really, in whatever little way we can, trying to encourage that to change. Because I think as a profession, we're drawing these conclusions. We're trying to argue, how vital we are to big corporations, right? Threat intelligence is really valuable, and all of this tracking and correlation that we're doing is really meaningful, and it helps defense. But if we can't explain how we do what we do, I think there's a huge gap in how we both justify our existence within an organization and how we convey confidence that what we're doing really is valuable and not smoke and mirrors. So I don't think that people, I don't know how to say this, it's like a triple negative. I think that internally people are showing their work to some extent, but as a field, we're not sharing that information, and we're not talking about best practices, and we're not talking about how we're coming to those conclusions. And I do think that that's a gap. Ryann, you want to add to that?
No, I actually think y'all did. Y'all said it. You kind of like hit it on the head. I also don't know, especially the current exercise that we're going through right now, as we work on another challenge. I don't necessarily know the solution, because I will admit that our industry is unique and that is rooted in secrecy in certain situations, rightfully so, because of what we're doing. So it's not like medical research where everything needs to be shared, right? It can be shared. So how do we walk that fine line between, like Jen said, I think people are sharing things internally. Then you probably have another level, which is working groups or share, trusted partnerships where maybe they share another level there. But then for people like us, we're on the outs, right? We're not actually doing, our typical intel work anymore. So we do look for public reporting to remain informed, right? That's one of our pieces of telemetry, if you will. So then we don't really have an idea of what's going on fully, but I don't know how much they can, right? So how do we address that? I don't know, but it's definitely a challenge. So in some ways, yes, it's improved. And then in some ways, not so much, like Jen said.
I'm going to pivot slightly. And I know
I always laugh when you say pivot.
I know, I was just like, but coming back to, like the investigation portion of your work, what do you all have to say about malware? Like, when does that become relevant in investigations? And is there a risk in relying too heavily on the malware families? Like, what are your opinions on that?
Yes, it's important and it comes into play. And there's also a risk in relying too heavily on that. It's funny because I feel like this makes me think of Ray in the conversation that we had with explain to school kids on like what you do for work and how do you explain malware, but or investigations. But I was telling Ryann that she should equate it to, if there's a break-in in your house, like how did they do it? Like, what did they use? And malware is a tool that people can use to conduct threat activities. But there's also, there's some malware there's some, that's really just software. It's legitimate software that that can be used maliciously. And sometimes it can be bought like over the counter. It's, like TeamViewer or something that you would use to help your parents with whatever's going on with their computer without having to go and drive over there. Sometimes it can be something that's offered from maybe like a criminal actors, somebody who's selling a tool that they can sell it to multiple other groups that can use it. So it's not necessarily a singular identifier. Like there's only this one group that uses this tool because you don't know where they're getting it from. Maybe it's shared. But it could be a group that has their own development capability. This is something that they create in-house and that they use. So it's something that it does come into play as it's a tool that's being used. But if you use that as a singular identifier and kind of ignore the context and everything else, other information, then you can go down the wrong the wrong path in that investigation.
Yeah,
Can we just please?
oh,
Sorry, go ahead, Ryan. No, you go.
No, I was just gonna say, I think when it, really when it matters is when it matters to you, and in your organization. Like if you're um a financial company and you find a piece of like ICS malware on someone's laptop, it's like, well, we don't have ICS systems, right? So this doesn't really affect us. So I just think putting it in context as to why it's relevant so that you don't spin up all of your wheels trying to reverse engineer. Well, you have to reverse engineer first to figure out what it's doing. But like after that, it's okay, right? I think the goal is just to kind of protect yourself. Sometimes we may go too far, right? I used to love coming up with cute names and all of that stuff. But I think how far you go with it just depends on what you need to track for you and your organization. So if you need to track the evolution so that you can improve your detections, then go for it. If naming makes it, more readily identifiable for you and your organization, then go for it. But anything outside of that, if it's not needed or helpful, then I think, maybe you can kind of leave it on the table.
I'd just like to see us please stop naming threat groups after malware families. Finally, after 15 years at least, please stop doing that.
What would you suggest instead?
They should be named separately.
Oh, okay.
It also implies that, if you're naming the threat group after the malware, the software, the tool, whatever, there's a very strong implication that this is the only group that uses that tool. And exactly to MB's point, we can't guarantee that. It's almost like trying to, ultimately prove that negative to say that, oh yeah, this whatever it is exclusive to this group. So we're gonna name them after the tool.
Okay.
Early mistakes that we made that we should have learned from a long, long time ago.
That dovetails nicely into another question I had, which is like, what common mistakes do you see analysts make early on in investigations? Or I guess like, what mistakes do you see like when you're conducting a workshop that people make when starting out on an investigation?
I think what I've seen is that it's easy to feel pressure to come to conclusions early on and to have solid information. And that often comes from outside, right? If you're doing an incident investigation, people want to know what happened and who's behind it. And those things take time and they take answers. So I think often there can be that pressure to have conclusions and have, high confidence, responses, and just trying to remember to just report what you know, acknowledge what you don't, and kind of go from there. So that has been a big one in my experience.
I think there's part of that is also like the internal pressure to kind of justify what you're doing. Like when I'm investigating something, like it's very easy to get excited about what you're doing and start to see connections in the same vein as that. What is that image of the guy with the cork board behind him and he's drawing like the lines for all those things where you're suddenly like, oh, this is so cool. Everything's related. And then you have to calm down or somebody else comes in and like, kind of pops your joy balloon and it's like, show me the evidence, and your evidence is not as strong as you thought. I think that's, as Jen said, that's one of the biggest risks is kind of whether it's an external pressure or an internal pressure of wanting to think things that are related or more significant than they may be, and not kind of keeping that like very skeptical mindset, especially when you're evaluating the evidence that you have, and just like moving a little bit too fast.
I guess my final question for all of you would be like, is there one thing that you've discovered that works for you that allows you to catch something that others might miss? Like any tricks or tips when you're investigating that you think might be helpful? It could be within Synapse or outside of it.
think I think for me, just being willing to pull on every thread.
Okay.
If I have the time, right? I'm typically like someone who's like slow and methodical. I just enjoy the hunt. And sometimes that can serve you, right? And then sometimes it can get you in trouble because it's like hours later you found nothing. But I do think it's helpful because technology evolves. And sometimes if you tend to just lean on prior, experiences or incidents, you may easily miss something. So I think it's important never to underestimate, actors. Know that technology, their, techniques, everything evolves. So kind of just looking for things that don't pass the smell test. I think that's important. So that's what I would say.
I think it's constant skepticism. I guess if you were to put it in intelligence community terms, it's that alternate competing hypotheses, but kind of getting into that habit of always, I don't want to say second guessing because that's kind of a harsh term, but basically always second guessing your own work. We tend to want to fit things into known patterns. So there's a very strong tendency for all of us to do that. Like MB was saying, you want to fit all the puzzle pieces together. So you're drawing all the strings and you're constructing that pattern in your head. But that ability to step back and say, okay, well, what other explanation could there be for what I'm seeing? Is the conclusion that I'm drawing the right one, or are there other things that I should be considering that maybe I'm not? So there's actually a lot of creative thinking, I think, in being an analyst, because you're trying to come up with those alternate scenarios, because patterns hold until they don't, right? Threat actors behave the same way until they suddenly do something that you've never seen them before. So that sort of built-in skepticism to kind of continually poke at what you're seeing, to kind of try to self-validate your own results, I think is really helpful and important.
I would agree with that. I think one of the things that's kind of amazing about the human brain is that we have the ability to justify almost anything. Like, we can be very creative in how we, come up with an argument for something. And it's kind of the responsibility, I think, to flip that and be like, how can I prove this wrong? Like, where can I poke holes in this? And just making sure that we're doing that to the best of our ability, to kind of, push back a little bit against that tendency that we have to say, like, yes, this makes sense, but maybe the evidence isn't there.
And a sense of humor.
Yeah.
That's helpful.
How does a sense of humor help in investigations?
Because if you've spent one of those days crawling down all the rabbit holes because you're pulling every thread to try and connect everything together and it doesn't go anywhere, like, the ability to laugh at that at some form at the end of the day is really helpful.
Do you have an example of that, though?
Our whole team is full of dry humor. You've seen us in Slack, Callie. You know how we roll.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. I feel like I don't know, humor is kind of a necessary outlet, because otherwise I feel like you can become very frustrated and kind of burn yourself out. Like, some of the things that what we're doing or what we're looking at, like, you think that you have something all tied up really neatly, and then there's like one really unfortunate bit of data that just like collapses your whole house of cards. And like, if you can't find something to laugh at about that, like, you're just going to be miserable. So humor is a necessary outlet, I think.
Yeah. And threat actors are humorous themselves. So even if you don't want to laugh, sometimes they'll put some Easter eggs in malware, director names, PDB paths. Something is going to make you laugh at a certain point too. So they help.
And the ability to name a made-up threat group. What was the rutabaga one, MB? Something rutabaga. Wasn't there a rutabaga somewhere?
There was a rutabaga. I don't know. I just remember wobbly emu.
Oh, yeah. So that's sometimes the humor outlet, I think, for a lot of analysts, is the ability to name threat clusters or malware families, which is why we get some of the silliness in the industry.
I like that. Awesome. Well, I really appreciate you all being here today. Rayne, the Silent Savage. This has been awesome. I know you guys do this as a personal favor to me, but I know our listeners really appreciate it. And I hope everybody will tune in for our next episode in the limited series. So we will catch you next time.
Thanks, Callie.
Thanks for listening to Signals and Stories. If you found this episode useful, be sure to follow the series and share it with your team. For more on how the Vertex Project approaches intelligence, from data modeling to real investigations, visit vertex.link. We'll see you in the next episode.